Well, I'm back in the hot tub, talking with conservatives, or people who suffer from conservative thoughts. Some of you may be aware that I'm writing a book about how we can turn morality into a science, how we can actually make a science of morality. And part of that refining process is I conduct roundtables once a month. And these roundtables, I bring a topic from my book, I present it to a group of people who are interested in morality or science or both. Well, I recently had a roundtable where a gentleman showed up. Let's call him Delmar. Now, Delmar identified himself as someone who lacks social cohesion. He doesn't understand social cues. He essentially had a 10-minute preamble before he actually spoke, and then he was worried about causing problems at this roundtable. And I reassured him. I said, it's okay. I will, notify you if things go badly. Please feel free to speak out. The roundtables that I conduct are completely open. And a lot of the people that attend my presentations fall into a few different categories. And Delmar fell into my least favorite category. He fell into the, for lack of better terminology, now I'm not a psychologist, but he fell into the psychopathy category. You see, normal people, for instance, when they see pictures of a child who's been severely beaten, which is part of my demonstration, I show pictures of children who have been severely beaten, and I talk about how science can demonstrate that the way that their parents abused them was in fact immoral, and the scars and blood and cuts and everything else that are on the child are the evidence that we use to demonstrate that something immoral happened. But in response to these pictures, Delmar raised his hand and he said, well, how do we know that that child didn't deserve those punishments? Immediately, I was taken aback. I said, Delmar, what could this child have possibly done to deserve to be tortured and beaten like this? And he had this sort of weird, convoluted answer that he did a lot of backpedaling. I think he realized what he said out loud and didn't like the implication, but he sort of danced a little while, and then he changed the subject and he said, well, how do we know that it was his mom that did it? How do we know it wasn't like a hailstorm or something? And so we talked about that for a little while, but you see, morally normal people that have a normal, neurologically functioning brain, see pictures of children being tortured and beaten and so on, and feel things like empathy. They think things that are compassionate and nurturing. They sometimes ask questions like, did that child survive? Are they okay? Or they want confirmation and reassurance that it all worked out in the end, that mother went to jail and that child is safe now. Normally functioning, morally normal people see a tortured child and think something sad, or they feel tortured themselves. They feel slighted. They feel wounded. But people that don't have morally normal brains, meaning their brain chemistry is neurologically abnormal, see a child who's been beaten and think things like what Delmar said. Well, how do we know that that child didn't deserve this? Now, it shouldn't be any surprise to you that beating children is a very conservative idea. In fact, violence in general is very conservative. As somebody who self-identifies as an ultra-progressive, violence is never the answer. But you see, I don't get my quote wisdom, unquote, from places like the Bible, from conservative sources, where it says very clearly to not spare the rod. In response to a mob of people gathering outside of his house, Lot thought to offer up his 2 daughters to be violently gang raped. That is not something a progressive would ever even consider. You would never placate a mob of rapists by offering them somebody to rape. I mean, it's just absurd, but that's what the Bible says. And that's what biblical conservatives and just conservatives in general suffer from. Because most conservatives get their wisdom from the Bible or from places like the Bible, religious sources, it's wrought with these kinds of inhumane issues. And recognize that it's always the degree to which a conservative rejects the Bible is the degree to which they are a compassionate, humane, and progressive person. When we think of like modern day progressives who are also religious, it's always the degree to which they've rejected their religion that makes them progressive. So you hear, Catholics or whatever talking about how they are just fine with homosexuals, but that's not because it's in their book. They've rejected and actually are in denial of a multitude of passages that very clearly and distinctly condemn homosexuals, but they say, well, I just don't read that part, or I don't believe in that part. I believe in this other part over here where it says turn the other cheek, or it says love thy neighbor. They always pick some stupid thing that can easily be taken out of context or isn't in itself moral or humane. It's just sort of vague and applies to everything. But if you were to really sit down with somebody like Stephen Colbert, let's say, and ask them why they accept homosexuals, they would say, because they're people, because I empathize with them, and because they have human rights. They would have all these progressive answers. And again, their humanity, their ability to empathize and have compassion is due to their rejection of their books. But the folks that have these conservative thoughts, that suffer from either conservatism or, in this case, in the case of Delmar, he's, I think, a psychopath, or at least he's on the psychopathy spectrum. Those folks are very much in alignment with the religious foundation of their conservatism. Delmar would later go on to say something else that I hear people say in response to my morality presentations in my book. And it goes something like this. I'm okay with the science. I'm okay with all of what you said. It all makes sense. Yes, I agree. It's a science. Okay, so under what conditions do we murder? And a lot of the times it starts kind of from left field, but they want to talk about values. This is something that conservatives really get stuck on. They think morality has to do with values. And so they say, well, what if my values are different than your values? Or they'll sometimes say, well, I have a different definition of morality, or I have a different morality than you do. And this is actually false. And it's false because you don't have a different morality if you have different values. In the science of morality, all of your actions, thoughts, and beliefs are weighed against whether or not they cause suffering or flourishing. So if you talk about having different values and thinking it's okay to cause suffering, or in this case, murder, you're just an immoral person. You're causing suffering, you're causing death. That's immoral. The science demonstrates that with the dead bodies that you produce. That's the evidence that demonstrates that your solutions are immoral. And there is no way to have a different set of values. If you do, let's say, have a different set of values, you're a psychopath, or you have an antisocial personality disorder, or some kind of issue that causes you to fail to be a moral person, to come to a cooperative, mutually beneficial moral outcome. And when I said earlier that that people don't have different values, there's some nuance worth exploring there. People do seem to have different values. There are, in fact, people who don't value life, and they're called psychopaths, or, have some other neurological disorder. But generally speaking, even folks like that value their own lives and don't want to be killed. They don't want to experience capital punishment in the justice system, and they don't themselves want to die. They do care about their lives. So they do value life. I think this distinction that Delmar was trying to make was that economically speaking, people value different things. But as it relates to a science of morality, picking between apples and oranges literally, I value apples, well, I value oranges. And that's what Delmar was kind of trying to argue. How do we solve that? The truth of the matter is that, scientifically speaking, people don't really differ in values that much. All people eat. Everybody values food. Delmar wanted to turn this into sort of a economics, social sciences situation where we have a process where we get from A to B, and the outcome is moral based on all these different values. But that's just describing individual moral systems that we see arising naturally in humanity. It's not talking about a science of morality where we engage in the scientific method to actually determine our answers to moral questions and hopefully guide our outcomes to be sound moral outcomes. Now, Delmar said he was on board with this and said he understood this, but then demonstrated that he didn't, and ultimately demonstrated that he's an immoral person. A friend of mine said this one time. He was talking about capital punishment, and he said, yeah, but if somebody killed your family, wouldn't you want them to die? And he's trying to defend capital punishment, which is immoral because it causes suffering. The dead body that is a result of the capital punishment, sentencing, and the carrying out of the execution demonstrates that it's immoral. So I do not support capital punishment. But my friend was just adamant. He said, but if somebody killed your family, wouldn't you want them to die? And I said, well, of course I would. And he said, well, then how can you be against capital punishment? And I said, I'm not Batman. Just because I want something to happen, I want justice. Just because I've been slighted doesn't mean that's how I want society to work. That doesn't mean that it's actually just or moral for society to carry out my wishes. Now, as somebody who engages in the science of morality, I understand why people have bloodlust. I understand why people want other people to die. I've wanted other people to die. I've wanted people I know to die. I've wanted people I don't know to die. I've wanted to kill people before, although I've never actually gave it real consideration, but I've certainly thought about it. I understand where that bloodlust comes from, and I wouldn't expect somebody who was slighted. It doesn't even have to be as severe as somebody killing your whole family. It could be somebody cutting you off in traffic. It could be somebody doing something that embarrassed you, and you kind of want them to die. But I don't want society to actually work that way. I don't want society to carry out my bloodlust wishes. But a conservative never gets that. And especially the kind of conservative I'm talking about here with Delmar. Delmar not only wants people to die, but he wants the state to kill them. He wants to be able to justify killing them with economics, scarcity and trade and money. That's what he was trying to get to when we were discussing this at my roundtable. Now, when he said, well, should we kill people and he was talking about Elon Musk, should we kill people like that? I said, look, Delmar, no matter what, advocating for the murder of people is immoral. We can demonstrate this with science. I have just demonstrated it to you scientifically that it is, in fact, immoral. So no, there is no narrative where the outcome is we kill people. It's inhumane, it's immoral, and it goes completely against all of the science of morality. So no, if you're going to advocate for killing people, you can just automatically recognize that that's immoral, and it's immoral because of the dead bodies that it produces, that pain and suffering, that death. And he kind of paused and backed up a little bit and sat back in his chair. And he said, yes, but, and then he tried to get back into it. And I said, no, but. There is no but, Delmar. It's time to end this conversation and move on to the next slide. I was doing a slideshow and he just got stuck for like 10 minutes. He was talking about this. So how does this all relate back to conservatism? Well, for one, conservatives are generally engaging in and expressing their bloodlust. Conservatives not only are willing to sell off their humanity to elect pedophiles and public figures that sexually assault other people. They don't care about any of that, but they're also willing to murder people in society over economic issues. I mean, Delmar was literally talking about the economic concept of a basket of goods. And when he was talking about Elon Musk, he was talking about how Elon's basket is really full. At what point do we just kill Elon? And I was like, we don't kill Elon. We educate and convert Elon to be a humane person. We become compassionate with Elon, and we use the scientific method to figure out the scientific process that Elon must undergo to become more humane, to be more compassionate. We want to incentivize and to relate with Elon so that he decides to share. And ultimately, perhaps we engage with society so that people that have the kind of resources Elon has are sort of forced to share. Now, I know some of you are, especially the conservatives in my audience, are saying, what? Force him to share? That's tyranny. Okay, well, just put down Atlas Shrugged for a minute and just think about how resources ought to be shared. There's some scenario in your conservative mind where you can understand why we would share and how we would share and how supporting other people and nurturing other people that don't have enough or don't have the things they need so that they do have the things they need is a public benefit and a public good and just good in general. It's good for everybody. Now, I'm not going to get into the politics or the social systems that we would engage in and implement in order to make sure that people like Elon are actually doing good with their money, that they're actually paying their taxes, for instance. But the punchline here is that these thoughts, this conservative thought is always coming from somewhere and is supported by something. And almost always, although a conservative might be so inarticulate that they can't tell you where it comes from, almost always it comes from some form of indoctrination. Conservatives seem to be very susceptible to indoctrination. And they're the kind of people that just don't question their indoctrination. And most indoctrination, which essentially is just the miseducation of children, that's what indoctrination is, but it's also the miseducation of adults too, and reinforcing things that aren't true, most of that comes from your religious past, your religious history. Most of you are religious. Some of you are religious and don't even know it. We were talking about self-awareness. I know people that say they're not religious, and then when you say, oh, okay, what does that mean you're an atheist, or what does that mean? They go, oh, no, I believe in God and Jesus. And you say, what? And they go, yeah, Jesus. And I say, so you believe Jesus is the Son of God? And they say, well, yeah. And I say, and you believe there is a God? And they say, yeah. And I say, well, then you're a Christian. And they go, no, I'm not. I don't go to church. That's how stupid people are. That's how lacking self-awareness makes you stupid. You're so stupid you don't even know that you're Christian. I mean, Christian. If you believe that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, you're a Christian. That's the only way to categorize you. So you're religious, and Christianity is a religion. But these goddamn conservatives, they don't even know anything about themselves, and they just make up whatever they feel like saying. It's just absolutely absurd and ridiculous. But that's where this bloodlust comes from, to get back to the point. You can tell I'm a little flustered. I'm sick of this. If you're a religious person, you have to make it okay that God's solution for your original sin was to torture and murder his child to death. That's the solution if you're Christian. And you have to make that torture and murder just. You have to make it a moral thing, when that is absolutely immoral. Jesus' dead body and the suffering that he went through makes that immoral. It makes it an immoral act against an innocent human being. And I'm not saying innocent capital I. I'm just saying Jesus didn't do anything to deserve to be tortured and murdered. And he certainly didn't deserve that to save your sins. And for a conservative person, this is what they must believe. And so bloodlust and the murder of other people, this sentiment that I hear sometimes at my roundtables and my other events where I lecture on morality, people saying, well, when do I get to murder? That's very clearly and obviously a conservative notion. It's a conservative idea that murder is going to be a solution. And sadly, the root of that idea, at least in modern Western society, is largely Christian in its origin. And that's because that was God's solution, to murder and torture to save your soul. I can't imagine actually getting to the gates of heaven and accepting God's invitation. If I got to the gates of heaven and God said, you're welcome in, come on in, I'd say, no, I reject this whole concept. I can't believe you murdered and tortured your own kid just for something I didn't do. But anyway, if you have bloodlust, if you're the kind of person, if you're like Delmar, and you're just waiting for me or somebody else in their humane, secular, scientific, moral system to tell you when you get to murder, do some self-reflection. Think about what it is that why is murder your answer? Why is killing people a solution? And if you're thinking money, you should think again, because we can actually just print money. That's a thing you can do. That's a thing any country can do. You can just print money. If you're thinking there's a shortage of resources and money and so on, think again. There is so much available to us now, and so much reason to acquire and utilize those resources for the greater good so that everybody benefits, that there really isn't much scarcity anymore. Now, I'm formally trained as an economist, so I understand scarcity. I'm sure you understand scarcity, and it sounds weird to say that there isn't enough scarcity to actually warrant murder, but really there isn't. Think of the thing that's scarce, and then think of how science and engineering and progressivism has solved those problems. And do yourself a favor. Think of your next best alternative to torture and murder. If you're feeling like you want somebody to die because of an injustice or your sense of fairness, what psychologists and anthropologists and sociologists refer to as our moral system, which is essentially a description of how people experience morality. It's not a science of morality in the way that I describe it, where I say we use science and a scientific method to determine what is and isn't a moral way to act, think, and believe so that we can actually be moral people. When you have a sense of fairness or a sense of justice, that's just a description of your experience of morality and what you would want done to, quote unquote, rectify or resolve the injustice that you perceive. That doesn't mean that your outcome, especially if it includes torture and murder, your bloodlust is not the moral conclusion because it causes torturing and murdering and suffering. So recognize that in yourself, or at least try to recognize that in yourself and see if you can figure out another path. And maybe you can't, but maybe then you should engage with a science of morality. Maybe you should invest in science of morality. Maybe you should, I would say buy my book, but that sounds a little too self-serving. It's not available yet anyway. I'm still editing it. But think of another way. There's almost always another way, a scientific way to actually raise all boats so that you benefit, and so does this person that slighted you. So does the group of people that you would like to murder. Thank you. This has been the Hot Tub Monologues.